This is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and you're listening to the Radical Radiance Podcast.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Radical Radiance Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca George, and I'm so excited to be back with you today as I sit down and chat with my friend, Elizabeth Urbanowicz. She has a brand new book coming out that I can't wait to tell you about. Elizabeth holds a MSED from Northern Illinois University in literary education and an MA in Christian apologetics from Biola University. She began her career as an elementary school teacher in a Christian school before she founded Foundation Worldview, where she now works full-time on developing comparative worldview and apologetics resources for children. Her goal is to prepare the next generation to be lifelong critical thinkers and lifelong disciples of Jesus Christ. You can connect with Elizabeth at foundationworldview.com. And we are here today to talk about her brand new book, Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design: 40 Questions and Answers on Sexuality and Gender. Elizabeth, I'm so grateful to have you back on the show today. Thanks for being with me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me on again, Rebecca. It's a joy to be with you because when I'm on with you, I feel like I'm just chatting with a good friend. So thanks so much for having me.
Me too. Me too. I loved our first conversation that we had, I guess, this past year, and I got such good feedback from our listeners on that conversation. It was so helpful. And so I was so excited when I heard about this book. I think it's such a needed resource for parents right now. And so I am just really thrilled to get to introduce it to my people. So I'll say the title again, Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design. And so the book is framed around these just really practical, real questions that parents face about sexuality and gender. And so I would love to start with what are maybe some of the most surprising or common fears that you hear from Christian parents today when it comes to these more difficult conversations?
I think that there's two main fears or concerns that I hear. The first one is just with the volume of information and just really twistings of God's good design that are coming down the pipeline. You know, who would have thought that we would need to be talking with our kids about what it means to be male or female,
Yeah.
in the way that we need to. So I think that there's just kind of the sense of fear of like, I don't know what's coming next. I don't even know all of what's out there. How do I prepare my kids for that? And so that's the first fear. And then I think the second fear that I hear most often is just parents don't even know how to start the conversation about sexuality because
Yeah.
we're bombarded with so much in our world. It just seems like, okay, I kind of want to protect my kids. I don't want them to be exposed to anything, but I don't even know how to open up the conversation. I don't know when they've been exposed to stuff. So I think that the fear really there is dual in not knowing if you're prepared to even understand all that's out there and then how to start the conversation with your kids.
Yeah, totally. I love that you encourage parents to start these conversations early and positively. I think the way we frame a conversation or even just our general heart and spirit around it just can really influence the way that our kids perceive it, right? Because
Yes.
whether we realize that or not, you're sort of a source of truth for them, right? And so how do you help a parent overcome maybe the awkwardness or the fears, as you're saying, of saying the wrong thing or whatever that fear might be so that they can really speak truth ultimately about God's design with confidence, right?
Yes. Well, I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to get over the mindset of having the talk with our
Yeah.
children. Because if it is just one talk, we just have one shot, and there is so
Right.
much fear of like, what if I get this wrong? Because we're human, and even if you practiced the most perfect script, you are dealing with another human being, which means
Yeah.
things are not going to go according to plan.
Yeah.
You have no idea what your child is going to ask or how they are going to respond. So I think first shifting that mindset from the talk to starting many talks, that this should really be dozens, if not even hundreds of conversations that we have with our children as they're
Yeah.
growing. And this, I think if we think of any other aspect of life, this makes sense. When you think about teaching your child how to cook, how to use the stove, how to use the oven, how to prepare ingredients, you're never going to be like, this is the stove, this is the oven, here's how you turn it on. Good luck. That would be
Yeah.
disastrous. Similar with teaching them to drive a car or, teaching them to make their bed, it's never a one and done conversation. And so with human sexuality, which God has designed and he's designed as good and is a huge part of life, we're just being very unwise if we think it's going to be
Yeah.
a talk. So that's my first encouragement to parents, then I just have two more pieces of encouragement for, really overcoming this fear. I think the first is understanding, where does our sense of fear or even shame come from? Because if we're teaching our
Mm.
kids how to cross the street, or we're talking with them about mathematics, or we're talking with them about, I don't know, the phases of the moon, anything we're teaching
Yeah.
them, there's usually not this same sense of like, oh, awkwardness, shame, embarrassment. I'm not sure. And really, when we look at scripture, God's word has the answers right in the opening chapters of Genesis. That in
Yeah.
Genesis chapter 2, after God fashions Eve out of Adam's rib and brings her to him, gives him to her in marriage, then the closing remark of that chapter is that the man and his wife were naked and were not ashamed. And so, in God's perfect design, there was no shame about our sexuality. Where then in chapter 3, when Adam and Eve rebel against the command that God gave them, and they chose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, immediately the immediate response is their eyes were opened. They realized they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together. So, this feeling of shame over our sexuality is just a result of the fall. And so, I think it's, if
Yeah.
we can recognize this is natural, this is the natural
Yeah.
response, we can then move forward and know, okay, this is the result of the fall, but I can move forward in helping my child understand God's good design. And then the third thing I recommend is starting the conversation early. Because if we
Yeah.
sit down and have this conversation with a 9, 10, 11-year-old, there are two people in the conversation that feel awkward, both people in it,
That's right.
us and our children. Yes. Where if we start this conversation really young, before our children have been exposed to anything, around the age of 4 or 5, there's only one person in the conversation who feels awkward, and that's us. And we can
Yeah.
then push through that and just have this open line of communication between us and our child, so that we can continue this conversation and they know that we're a safe place to come to with any of their questions or concerns. So that's really my encouragement for
Yeah.
parents in pushing through this fear or awkwardness.
Yeah. That's so helpful. So, two thoughts. If a parent's listening and they're thinking, okay, well, I have a 6-year-old and I'm sitting in this awkwardness of like, there are things that I feel like I should be communicating, but I've not done any of that yet. Where do they start? Right. And then if there is this guilt or shame around, I've not done a good job so far, how do we get over that? Right.
Yes. First, just very practically, I love the way you framed that question, Rebecca, because it's like, okay, what do we do? How do we start? Because we want
Yeah.
to talk about like, yeah, we need to start these conversations early. We need to have them often, but like, okay, what does it look like
What do
for
we
me to talk to my
say? Yeah.
child? Yes, exactly. And so I recommend that parents start off with 3 foundational conversations. Now, I'll model what this would look like having with a child who's somewhere between the ages of 4 and 6. If you're
Oh, I
thinking, oh my
love it.
goodness,
Yep.
my child is 9, like I haven't had any of these conversations, that's okay.
You've not messed it you've not
No,
messed it up.
right.
Yeah.
You can have these same conversations. I just recommend that before you have them, you open them up by asking your child what they have already heard or what they
Yes.
think they know, because that provides you with an opportunity to know, okay, where are they coming from in this? What is their level of understanding or misunderstanding? And then you can affirm the fact that they shared with you what they've heard. And then you can say, you know what? I want to talk with you now about God's good design. And that's when you can dive into these conversations and help correct any misunderstandings that they've had. But if you're
Mhm.
having these conversations with a younger child, I'll model what that looks like. And I recommend 3 conversations. The first conversation is just about genitalia. How can you
Yeah.
tell if you're a boy or a girl? Which many parents have already had this conversation. The second conversation is the most difficult one. It's just the basics, the basic mechanics of sexual intercourse. And then the third one is the basics of reproduction. So with starting off
Yep.
the first conversation about genitalia, if you've never had this conversation before, recommend you ask your child, okay, what is your favorite toy? What is your most special toy that you own? And then talk about the toy, why it's so special. Then say, okay, how do you treat this special toy different than you treat your other toys? Maybe your
Mhm.
child keeps it up on a high shelf so that their younger sibling can't grab it. Or maybe the toy stays in their room when guests come over so that nobody else plays with it. Or maybe they don't take this toy outside so it doesn't get dirty. And then make the connection to our bodies and say, just as we have special toys that we treat with more care than all of our other toys, God has given us special body parts that we treat with more care than any other part of our body. And then this is where you're going to want to explain, if you haven't already, the anatomically correct term for their
Yep.
genitalia. So you can say, so if you don't want your child to hear this and they're listening, you can just pause for a second
Yes.
and put in some earbuds.
That's right.
But you can say, okay, God designed you as a boy, so this special part of your body is called your penis. Or God designed you as a girl, so this special part of your body is called your vagina. And then you can, if your child doesn't have a sibling of the opposite gender, you can explain
Yeah.
what the opposite private part is. And then you can say, you know what? These parts of our bodies are so special that when we're out in public, we're going to call them our private parts because they should be kept private, that nobody should look at this part of your body or touch it unless your dad and I are helping take care of you or a doctor is examining you. And then you can
Yep.
ask your child if they have any questions. Now, this is a lot of times for some parents, the scariest part, thinking, oh my goodness, but what if my child asks me something that I don't know the answer to? Or what if it's like really awkward? Or what if I fumble and give the wrong answer? That's where I say, this is the benefit of being the parent. You have them, for the next 10 to 12 years, however long it is in your care. And so just keep your poker face on, even if they ask you something that disturbs you, and say, oh, I am so grateful that God has given you a mind that thinks through things carefully. That is such a gift. And then just simply say, you know what, I'm going to need a little more time to be able to answer that question. So tomorrow we'll come back and we'll talk about it again. And you've just bought yourself 24 hours to calm your racing heart and mind, to do some research, to talk with your spouse, to talk with a friend.
Get on the same page.
Yes. And get a biblically solid answer. So that's the first question, first conversation, just about genitalia. Then on another day, have the conversation about the basic mechanics of sex. And the way I recommend you start this conversation is by saying, have you ever made a promise to someone? And talk about any promises your child has made. Or if they haven't made any promises, talk about promises you've made to them. Like, do you remember last week I promised that if you cleaned up your room, I would take you to the park? And then say, you know what? When people make very serious promises, sometimes they do things with their body to show that they are going to keep that promise. Like sometimes people shake hands, or they might lock pinkies. Or if you're a homeowner, you can say, when I bought this house, I had to sign a whole bunch of papers to show that I was promising to pay for this house. And then you can turn the conversation then towards marriage and say, do you know that marriage is a promise? That's right.
Yeah.
It's a promise between one man and one woman. They make that promise to one another and to God that they're going to love one another and care for one another in a way that they don't love or care for anybody else, and that they're going to do that so long as they're both alive. And then you can make the really awkward, hard part. The first time you say it is going to be the most difficult. After that, it gets easier. You can say, just like people do things with their bodies to show that they're confirming a promise, like shaking hands, God has given a special act between a husband and a wife to confirm the promise of marriage. And this act is called sex. Sex is when a man places his penis inside a woman's vagina. And this act reminds the husband and the wife that they have promised to love one another and care for one another for their whole lives. And then again, you can open up the conversation, say, do you have any questions? And if your child is kind of like, ew, that's weird or that's gross, you can just say, you know what? That's okay if sex sounds kind of strange right now, because who did God design sex for? That's right, for a husband and a wife. Are you going to get married anytime soon? No, It's going to be so long before you get married. So you don't need to worry about sex right now, but you've just opened up that conversation. And the first time you say that is the hardest. After that, it'll get easier. Third conversation, another day, basics of reproduction. Take your child for a walk throughout the neighborhood and notice all of the flowers and bushes and trees, and then say, look at this flower. Do you know how this flower got here? Well, somebody planted a seed in the ground, and when it got water and sunlight, eventually the seed sprouted and it started to grow until it grew into this beautiful flower. And then you can explain that God has created our bodies with something similar to seeds. And you can explain that God has created boys' bodies with something called sperm and women's bodies with something called eggs. And you can explain these are different than the chicken kind of eggs that we eat.
Yep.
They're very, very tiny inside a woman's body. You can say, now we've seen lots of women who have babies growing inside of them. And you may have wondered how the baby got there. And you can explain that when a man and a woman have sex, his penis releases some sperm into her vagina. And if the sperm meets the egg, then a baby starts to grow. And talk about how babies are always a gift from God. And then again, open it up for any questions. But I think if you can just have these 3 foundational conversations, those are the hardest ones, then you can consistently build upon there in the coming years.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to first say that was the most clear conversation modeling that I've ever heard for having these conversations. So I feel like all of our moms who are listening right now need to just bookmark this podcast, save it for a rainy day as you're having to have these conversations with your children in the future. I know that I will do this when, Lord willing, Dustin and I have children one day, and this is so helpful. And these are the types of things that you talk about in this book. And so that's why I think it is just such a practical, helpful, needed resource for parents. And so I would love to have your wisdom for a minute as kids are growing into these maybe older ages and they're asking more questions. They're learning how to think about these things biblically. What does it look like for parents to help their kids think critically about messages from media and peers at school in light of God's good design rather than just like memorizing rules, right? I can remember the first information I ever knew about sex happened on a playground, right? And so how do we meet our kids in those moments and have thoughtful, good conversations around God's good design rather than it just feeling like a list of rules?
Yes, I think that's a great question, Rebecca, because we don't want to just give our kids a list of rules and, with no explanation of like,
That's right.
why is
Yeah.
this good? Why is this right? And so I recommend, again, at a young age, it doesn't need to be 4, but, somewhere around, 6, 7, 8, taking your kid out to the garage where you hopefully have bikes. Or if you don't have a bike, go over to a neighbor's house to look at the bike and then
Yeah.
ask them, why did the designer design this bike? And then talk about how the purpose of a bike is to get you from one point to another point more quickly than you could walk. If you want to go 2 miles, it's probably going to take you, probably like 30 minutes at least minimum to walk 2 miles, where you can go 2 miles on a bike probably in even under 15 minutes. And then say, how did the designer design the bike to be used? And then talk about how you put your bottom on the seat, you put your feet on the pedals, you put your hands on the handlebars, and then as your feet pedal, you steer yourself. Then say, now, what if you decided, or what if somebody decided that they didn't like the way that the designer had designed the bike? And instead of pedaling with their feet, they wanted to pedal with their hands. So what if somebody decided that's what they wanted? Could they try to ride the bike that way? They could. They could. They own the bike. They can choose to do that. However, what would happen if somebody tried to pedal this bike with their hands? Well, one, they get tired really quickly because our arms were not designed to do that same type of work that our legs were designed to do. Second, they're probably going to fall over because it's really hard to balance if you are, if you're hunched over on the bike. And then are you actually going to go fast on this bike like it was designed to? No. So if you choose to use this bike in a way that goes against the designer's design, you can do that. But you're probably going to end up getting hurt. The bike might end up getting hurt. And both you and the bike are going to miss out on the purpose for which the designer designed the bike. And then you can move that conversation to sexuality and say, similarly, God is the one who designed our bodies and our minds. He's the one that invented sex. And so if we want to know the purpose of sex and how sex is best used, we need to go to the designer. Just like we go to the designer of the bike, we read the instruction manual for how is this bike designed to be used. And so I think that analogy can just help kids understand that it's not just like, well, God said it, so we do it, which yes, to an effect, like God said it, we do it. But why? Because God is the designer. He's the one that understands the design of this gift and how it works best. And then as our children are getting older and they're hearing more messages from the culture, sometimes this can happen even as young as 5, but they might not pick up on it as much. But as our children, are 8 or 9 and friends are starting to talk more about sex and joke more about it, and they're seeing more things in the media that they're more aware of, or they're just more aware of their surroundings, I think helping cast a vision for what would the world look like if everybody followed God's design for sex. Now we know this isn't going to happen, because we're on the other side of Genesis 3, but helping cast that vision, saying, okay, what would no longer exist in our world if everybody followed God's design for sexuality? Well, there wouldn't be any more babies that were born to a mom and dad who weren't married. That would be amazing, wouldn't it? If all babies had a married mommy and daddy, there wouldn't be any more sexually transmitted diseases because everybody would just be having sex with one other person. There wouldn't be any more rape because people would just be having sex with those that they were married to. And what if everybody followed God's design for marriage? What if every husband loved their wife in the way that Jesus has loved the church? Oh my goodness, then every wife would be so well loved. And what if every wife lovingly submitted to the leadership of her husband? Oh my goodness, marriages would be so much better. So to just help cast this vision for our kids that the biblical view of sexuality doesn't require some restraint on the sexual urges that are developed in adolescence. Absolutely, it does require restraint. But what would be the outcome if everybody followed the designer's design. It would be flourishing. It would be a society
Yeah.
that was flourishing. So I think if we can help cast that vision for our kids, especially as they're getting older, because what they're going to be told consistently from the world around them, from the media, from everything, is that the biblical view is just oppressive, that it's just holding
Yeah.
you back, where it's like, no, if we look at what the world would look like if everybody followed the biblical view, it would be a world that's flourishing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so beautiful. I love that. For maybe a parent listening today who's thinking, okay, I'm in the place right now where I feel like I'm running I'll say that again. For a parent who feels like right now they are just running interference against culture, is at least is what it feels like that term is just coming to mind for me. How would you want to coach them just in how they're showing up to do that with their child in a way that models grace and truth and doing it in a loving way? Like, if for a parent who's listening and they turned on this episode because that is where they feel like they're just on the defense almost. What encouragement or coaching would you want to give them?
Yeah. So my response for someone who's a parent of a teen, which that's not my area of expertise, but that my response for that would look a little bit different because teens are growing. But for anybody who's parenting a child who is 12 and under, my response would be to focus on two things. Actually, no, I misspoke. My response would be to focus on three things,
Yeah.
actually. Focus
Yeah.
on three things. The first thing that I would focus on is making sure that you have healthy boundaries around your children. Now, healthy
Yeah.
boundaries doesn't mean you completely pull them out of the world, and you raise them in a bubble. Like that's not
Right.
healthy for anybody. But, is your child on a device on their own? Because really, I know this is hard to hear, but really when they're under the age of high school, they really should not be on a
Yeah.
device on their own. It just is not healthy because, the pornography industry and even just sexual predators out there, it's not like they're waiting out there waiting to catch some children. It's a predatory industry.
Right.
So they're
That's right.
actively seeking your child. So your child really shouldn't be on devices on their own. And then look around, who are you having your child spend the most time with? Again, we can't completely pull them out of the world, but if you're noticing that whether it's the school situation or the sports situation or whatever is really drawing your child's heart away from the Lord, I would really encourage you to just prayerfully consider, is this where the Lord has me have my child right now?
Yeah.
Because we get 18 short years with our kids, and when they're 36, really the only thing that we're going to care about is, are they walking with Jesus? That's the
Yeah.
only thing that we're going to care about. We're not going to care about like what kind of medal did they get their sophomore
Right.
year
Yep.
of soccer season. So that would be my first encouragement. My second encouragement would be just make it a habit of starting to talk daily about the goodness of God's design. And it doesn't just have to be about God's design for sexuality. Like when you're preparing a meal, you're sitting down to eat a meal, talk about all the different colors on your plate. Like, isn't it amazing that God has designed the world so that there's so many different types of fruits and vegetables and animals and grains? And this is how God designed for us to get refueled. We could have just had to touch a tree, to get
Yeah.
refueled. Like, look at the amazingness of God's design. But just keep talking about the goodness of God's design. And as it comes up with sexuality and gender, continually talk about the goodness of God's design, because that needs to be the focus. Because if you feel like you're really, running interference and you're just playing defense, yes, playing defense is necessary, but you have to play offensive
Yeah.
well. And
That's right.
the amazing thing is that God's design is good. It is
Yeah.
inherently good, and He's the one that has designed it. So continually bring up, as you're complimenting your children or encouraging them, don't just encourage them, but encourage them specifically of, I'm so grateful that God has made you a boy that is gifted in X, Y, or Z, or I'm so grateful God has made you a girl who's gifted in X, Y, or Z, so that you're continually pointing to the goodness of God's design for males and females. So I would really encourage parents to do that. And then the third thing that I would really encourage parents to do is to teach your kids to think critically, because our kids are going to need skills to evaluate the ideas that come their way. So when you hear them come home from school or they respond to like a commercial, on a show that you're watching as a family, don't just immediately cut in with why that's wrong or your response to it. Ask them good questions. Well, what did you think about that? Why do you think that's true? What are some reasons you think that's true? Just ask them good questions to be able to get them to be thinking critically. I was actually thinking of this the other day, and my mom did this all the time when I was growing up, and it drove me nuts. Like, it drove me nuts. And I just learned, like, never watch a movie when a friend's over, because mom is going to pick up the remote
Yeah.
and start asking you questions. And it was like so embarrassing. But now I can look back and say, I'm so grateful that my mom did that, because even when I was rolling my eyes and I was giving huffy breaths, or I was like, gosh, I was so awful as a teenager, like, even as I was like, standing up and walking out and slamming the door, frustrated about things, my mom was subtly training me to carefully evaluate these ideas. And we're not going to be with our kids 24/7 to be able to help them sift through everything that they're going to encounter. But what we can do is we can give them skills that they can then transfer into any situation they encounter. So that would be my encouragement to parents.
Yeah, so good. I love that so much. We've covered so much ground in this conversation and given parents so much wisdom and encouragement and just really practical tools that will help you in these conversations. I want to talk a little bit about where to get the book here in just a moment. But before we do, there's a question that I ask all of my guests that come on the Radical Radiance podcast. I love having guests come back because the Lord is always at work in us and just always showing us new things about himself and just refining us. And so the question I always love asking is, in this season of your life, Elizabeth, what about Jesus makes you radiant?
I think in this particular season, I am just so grateful for his patience with me that this past month has just been, life is always hard, but this past month has been a harder month. And I've just seen in myself just similar sin patterns come to the surface that I have just struggled with, for decades now. And I can see victory, small little victories that the Lord has given. But I just think, man, God, like, if I were you, which thank God I'm not, but if I were you, like, I would have given up on me so long ago, because it's so, just looking from the outside, I'm like, it's so frustrating that I'm still struggling with the same thing over and over again. And so I'm just so grateful for the Lord's patience with me, and the fact that it's him that makes me radiant, not any merit of my own, because if it was me trying to make myself radiant, it would be a very, very dingy radiance. But just so grateful for God's patience and the fact that it's him that shines through.
Amen. So good. Well, I want to say the full title of the book one more time. It's called Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design, 40 Questions and Answers on Sexuality and Gender. So for our friends listening who want to connect more with you, learn more about Foundation Worldview, all of those things, where can they connect with you, find the book?
Yeah. So if you can remember the name of the company, Foundation Worldview, if you just go to foundationworldview.com, there you can find out all the information about our organization. You can also find information about the book there. But if you just go to your favorite retail website, whether it's Amazon or Christian Books or Barnes & Noble, you can find the book on any of those retail sites as well.
Amazing. Well, Elizabeth, I am so grateful for you. Thank you for writing this book. I know it will help a lot of parents, and I'm excited to introduce it to our friends today. So thanks for being with me.
Oh, thanks for having me on. It's been a joy to be chatting with you again, Rebecca.
I hope you loved that conversation with Elizabeth as much as I did. Go grab a copy of Helping Your Kids Know God's Good Design, 40 Questions and Answers on Sexuality and Gender, wherever you like to buy books. And we will be back next week for another incredible conversation. I can't wait to chat with you then.